December 19th, 1959. Osprey, Florida. After spending the day running errands and visiting a family friend, 25-year-old Cliff Walker and his 24-year-old wife Christine and their two children, 3-year-old Jimmie and 23-month-old Debbie, head back home in separate vehicles. The following morning, the family's bodies are discovered inside their rural house. They were each shot in the head before Debbie was drowned in the bathtub, and Christine has been sexually assaulted. Over the next several decades, investigators would look at a number of different suspects, including Perry Smith and Richard Hickock, who were responsible for murdering the Clutter family in Kansas 1 month earlier. But in the end, no one is ever conclusively linked to the Walker family murders. After that, the trail went cold.
Hello everyone, and welcome to our final holiday-themed episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and today we're going to be covering a pretty horrific and infamous cold case, the Walker family murders. That voice you just heard narrating our intro was Alanna LaForce, the winner of our most recent Trail Went Cold listener voiceover contest, so thank you very much, Alanna. This is a recurring monthly contest which we've been carrying on for over 2 years now, and if you'd like to enter and haven't already done so, I will be providing instructions at the end of this episode. Anyway, as you probably know, for the month of December, I usually release episodes about mysteries which took place around Christmas time. Over the years, I've received a couple of requests to cover this particular case, but I thought now would be the most appropriate time, since the date of this episode's release is December the 18th, 2019, and tomorrow will officially mark the 60th anniversary of the crime. This story involves a married couple and their 2 young children, who were all brutally murdered inside their home as they were preparing for the holidays. The investigation would uncover quite a few potential suspects, but there was no conclusive evidence to point to anyone in particular. But the case has taken a very interesting turn in recent years, as investigators have explored the possibility that the perpetrators might be Perry Smith and Richard Hickock, who committed one of the most infamous crimes ever when they murdered the Clutter family inside their farmhouse in Kansas, a story which became the subject of Truman Capote's iconic true crime book, In Cold Blood. There are some striking similarities between the murders of the Clutters and the Walkers, and compelling evidence that Smith and Hickock were in Florida at the time the Walkers were killed. However, a recent attempt to exhume the killer's remains for DNA testing failed to bring about a definitive conclusion, so in this episode, we're going to explore all the different possibilities about who might have been responsible for this crime. Anyway, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music, and Spotify. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, which may include stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content. Oh, and I also wanted to make one more special announcement. Next Wednesday happens to be Christmas Day, so we're going to take that week off, and this will be our last official episode of 2019. However, we shall return on Wednesday, January the 1st, 2020, and we'll be releasing a special update episode in which I discuss all the cases we featured on The Trail Went Cold, which have since been solved or experienced some major developments. So with all that out of the way, let us now delve into the Walker family murders. Our story begins in 1959 in Osprey, Florida, a small town of only a few thousand people located in Sarasota County. One of our victims is 25-year-old Cliff Walker, who lives just outside of Osprey with his 24-year-old wife, Christine Walker, and their 2 children, 3-year-old Jimmie and 23-month-old Debbie. The couple have been married for 5 years and originally hailed from the town of Arcadia before they decided to move to Sarasota County. The Walkers currently reside at Palmer Ranch, a 14,000-acre property of land owned by one of the area's wealthiest families. In exchange for working there as a ranch hand, Cliff and his family are allowed to live rent-free in an isolated farmhouse at a cattle ranch on the property, which is located at the end of a 2-mile dirt road and about a mile away from the nearest neighbors. On Saturday, December the 19th, the Walkers were preparing for the holidays, and a Christmas tree which they had not had time to decorate was currently resting on their front porch with wrapped Christmas gifts underneath it. On this particular day, the family went into town to run several errands, which included visiting a couple of used car lots and test driving a vehicle, as Cliff was looking to trade in his family's older model car for something newer. The Walkers eventually went to visit Don and Lucy McLeod, who lived in another isolated farmhouse on the Palmer Ranch property about 20 minutes away from the Walker residence. Like Cliff, Don worked as a ranch hand in exchange for living on the property rent-free, and the 2 men spent part of the afternoon hunting together. When they returned to the McLeod residence, Cliff started loading up a Jeep with sacks of cattle feed, which he needed to take back to his house. Christine would go on ahead and drive back home in the family car, but since Jimmie and Debbie wanted to ride with their father in the Jeep, the children stayed behind. Approximately 15 minutes after Christine left, Cliff finished loading up the cattle feed and drove away from the McLeod residence with his children shortly before 4 p.m., but this would turn out to be the last time the McLeods saw them alive. At 5:30 a.m. on the morning of December 20th, Don McLeod traveled to the Walker residence as he was planning to go hog hunting with Cliff. When he arrived, Don was surprised to see that the sacks of cattle feed were still inside the parked Jeep, along with Cliff's hunting rifle. Don became concerned when he discovered that all the house's doors were locked and no one would answer. He decided to use his pocket knife to cut a slit through the screen on the back door and use the knife to prop open the latch and enter the house. When Don walked inside, he was shocked to discover Christine's body lying on the living room floor in a pool of blood in the doorway to the dining room. Christine had been raped and beaten by an unknown assailant before she was shot twice in the head. The bodies of Cliff and Jimmie were lying on the floor in another section of the room. Cliff had been shot beneath his right eye, while Jimmie was shot in the head 3 times, and there were streaks of blood on the floor to indicate that the boy had crawled toward his father after the first time he was shot. This prompted Don to flee the house and find a payphone to call the Sarasota Police Department. When they arrived at the house, the police followed another trail of blood into the bathroom, where they discovered Debbie's body lying face down inside the bathtub. Debbie had been shot once in the head, but someone had also stuffed a sock in the drain and filled the bathtub with about 4 inches of water. It was believed that the killer had run out of bullets after firing the first shot into Debbie, and since she was still alive, he decided to drown her in the tub. Jimmie's cowboy hat was also found on the floor with a bullet hole in it, so the killer may have used it to cover Debbie's face when he shot her. The killer had apparently locked the door when they left the house, and a number of .22 caliber cartridges were found at the scene, though the second shot, which was fired into Christine, was a .32 caliber slug. A red cellophane cigarette wrapper from a brand Cliff did not smoke was also on the living room floor. Cliff ordinarily smoked Cool brand cigarettes and had purchased a carton of them on the day he was killed, but they were apparently taken by the person who shot him. Cliff's pocket knife was also stolen, and strangely, the Walker's marriage certificate, which was normally hung inside a frame on the living room wall, was also missing. There didn't seem to be anything else stolen from the house, but it was later discovered that a drum majorette uniform Christine had worn in high school and ordinarily kept in a plastic bag inside a cedar chest had been stolen as well. As far as physical evidence pointing to outside intruders, there appeared to be unidentified fingerprints on the bathtub faucet, though in later years, it was determined that it was most likely a palm print. 2 hairs were also found, which were inconsistent with anyone from the Walker family. One of them was a dark hair found inside the bathroom, while the other was a blonde hair inside Christine's dress. Investigators attempted to retrace the victims' movements to figure out how the murders might have taken place. Christine had left the McLeod residence and arrived home before her husband and children, but it turned out she did not park the car in its usual spot in front of the house. This led to speculation that the killer was already there and had parked their own vehicle in this spot before Christine arrived. Indeed, a local resident who flew their plane over the property that afternoon at approximately 4:20 p.m. recalled seeing two cars parked outside the house. Unfortunately, when a deputy arrived at the scene, he parked his car in that spot and may have destroyed tire track evidence for the killer's vehicle. Christine's purse was hung up in the kitchen, groceries she purchased earlier that day had been put away, and a Christmas card she had received from Lucy McLeod was on top of the refrigerator. This seemed to suggest that Christine may have been familiar enough with her killer to invite him inside the house and allow him to wait there while she performed her household tasks. A quilt from Jimmie's bedroom was stained with blood, and the evidence showed that Christine was raped on top of the bed before the killer fired his first shot at her, which only grazed the top of her head. He then dragged Christine's body into the living room and fired a second shot into her head. It seemed like the killer was using the quilt to wipe blood from Christine's legs, but may have been interrupted when Cliff and the children arrived home. One of Christine's high-heeled shoes was found on the porch, while the other one was in the bedroom, and they both had blood on them, and the bruises and abrasions on Christine's face indicated that she had put up a fight against her attacker and attempted to use her shoes as weapons. After leaving the McLeod residence in the Jeep, Cliff and the two children were seen stopping at a gas station, so the approximate time they would have arrived home was around 4:30. Cliff had been shot from a distance, so he was likely ambushed and killed instantly the moment he set foot in the house. A few months after the murders, bloody clothing belonging to Cliff and Christine was found inside a shed about a mile from the Walker residence, so the killer likely used the clothing to clean themselves up when they left. Unfortunately, the local police were woefully inexperienced with handling a crime of this nature. Believe it or not, they did not even possess a good camera, so they had to get a news photographer to take pictures of the crime scene for them. Bloody cowboy boot prints were found at the house, and for the longest time, it was assumed they belonged to the killer, but it turned out the prints were from a deputy who had accidentally stepped into a pool of blood in the living room. In addition, if you look back at the original newspaper accounts of the case, you can find statements from the Sarasota County Sheriff that Christine was not sexually assaulted, but this was not true, as semen was found on Christine's underwear, which would become crucial evidence in this case. Over the course of the investigation, at least 587 people would be looked at as possible suspects. I'm going to start off by naming potential suspects who have since been cleared. One of them was Don McLeod, who originally discovered the bodies. Another person of interest was Cliff's cousin, Albert Walker, who lived around 70 miles away in the town of Wauchula and just happened to show up on Osprey on the day the bodies were found. When Albert arrived at the murder scene, he broke out into hysterics, and he had an equally emotional breakdown at the family's funeral, where he fainted twice and had to be carried out of the church. Some people found Albert's behavior suspicious and thought he might be staging his emotional outbursts to cover up his own involvement, as there were rumors that he was enamored with Christine. Albert also raised some eyebrows when he claimed that he traveled to Osprey in order to speak to Cliff about a Christmas party he was hosting, but it turned out that Cliff was never planning to host any party. Another odd detail was that when Albert originally arrived in Osprey, he stopped at a local gas station to ask for directions to the Walker residence, even though he had briefly lived there on a previous occasion and should have known where it was. However, both Albert and Don McLeod passed polygraph tests, and in 2005, they voluntarily submitted themselves to DNA testing. By this point, it was determined that the semen found on Christine's underwear did not belong to Cliff and was likely left by her killer when he raped her, but the DNA did not match Don or Albert and officially cleared them as suspects. But there were other potential suspects who have never been DNA tested. Investigators looked at a meter reader named Stanley Mauck, who serviced the Walker residence. While there was no direct evidence to link Malk to the crime, he spent time in a mental institution and received electroshock therapy because he claimed he was sometimes overwhelmed by an uncontrollable urge to kill his wife and children. Another detail which put Malk on the police's radar is that he also happened to be the meter reader at a house where another brutal murder took place only 4 months earlier. On August the 7th, 1959, the body of a 22-year-old University of Florida student named Chandler Steffens was discovered inside a house he was renting from his stepmother in Sarasota, which is located just 10 miles northwest of Osprey. Steffens was found hogtied, and his head was completely wrapped with adhesive tape. The killer had only left Steffens' nostril holes uncovered so he could breathe, and then proceeded to torture him with a knife for hours before his throat was cut. The crime became known as the Sarasota Mummy Murder and remains unsolved to this day. Other than the fact that Stanley Malk was the meter reader at both residences, there was nothing to link this crime to the Walker murders, and Malk died of brain cancer in 1997. Investigators were told that a couple of different men from the area had made inappropriate advances on Christine, but one person who stood out was 65-year-old Wilbur Tooker. Tooker lived about a mile from the Walker residence and was their closest neighbor, and he seemed to have an obsession with Christine. On more than one occasion, Tooker had stopped by the house while Cliff was away and attempted to kiss Christine. When Cliff found out about this, he became so angry that he reportedly had to be talked out of killing Tooker, but he still confronted him and warned Tooker not to come around their house anymore. On the day of the murders, Tooker's whereabouts could be accounted for after 5 p.m., as he had dinner with a friend in Sarasota before going to a local high school to play the violin in an orchestra at a concert later that night. However, Tooker technically had no alibi between 4 and 5 o'clock, the exact time period the Walkers were killed, and he passed away in March of 1963. Investigators were also contacted by the cousin of a man named Curtis McCall, who believed that Curtis may have been conducting a secret affair with Christine. Curtis was a former high school boyfriend of Christine's, and 2 weeks before the murders, while Cliff was away at a rodeo, Christine supposedly stopped by the home of one of Curtis's relatives in Arcadia to look for him. A couple of Christine's friends also claimed that she had asked them how to terminate a pregnancy. Christine had actually experienced 2 miscarriages in 1959, so there was gossip about the possibility of her becoming pregnant with a secret lover. Curtis was also believed to have owned a .22 caliber pistol, was known for having a violent temper, and reportedly appeared nervous and on edge following the murders. When he was interviewed by investigators, Curtis denied ever having an affair with Christine, and while he admitted to once owning a .22 caliber pistol, he claimed to have since sold it to someone whose name he could not remember. Curtis was also given a polygraph test, and according to the results, the only question he answered which indicated deception was, "Have you withheld any information from law enforcement officers about the Walker murders?" There was ultimately no evidence to implicate Curtis, but when police attempted to track him down for DNA testing in 2005, he could not be located. There were a number of other interesting leads which went nowhere. Emmett Monroe Spencer, a convicted murderer on death row at Rayford Prison, sent in a letter to police in which he confessed to the Walker murders. However, his confession was soon discredited once investigators determined that he was in California at the time the murders took place. Spencer was known for being a pathological liar, and while his confession provided enough correct details about the crime to suggest he might be involved, it turned out he learned this information from newspaper articles about the case. This was an unfortunate side effect of the police requiring a news photographer to take pictures of the murder scene, as a number of these photos were published in the newspapers and provided enough details for Spencer to construct his false confession. In August of 1994, an anonymous woman called the Sarasota County Sheriff's Office, who claimed to be a bartender from Stroudsburg, Pennsylvania. She said she was talking to one of her regular customers, whom she described as a retired white male in his 60s who worked odd jobs in the area, before he suddenly started crying. When she asked what was wrong, the man told her that he had once killed some people named Walker in Osprey, Florida, many years ago. The woman said she would call back later with more information, but she never did, and this tip was never verified. The most interesting development would take place in 2012, when the Sarasota County Sheriff's Office announced they were exploring the possibility that the Walker family murders might be connected to the murder of another family, which also happened to be one of the most infamous crimes in American history. Many of you are probably already familiar with this story, but here's a quick refresher. During the early morning hours of November the 15th, 1959, a pair of ex-convicts named Perry Smith and Richard Hickock, who had recently been paroled from the Kansas State Penitentiary, entered a farmhouse located outside the town of Holcomb. The occupants of the house at that time were 48-year-old Herbert Clutter and his 45-year-old wife Bonnie, along with their 16-year-old daughter Nancy and 15-year-old son Kenyon. The family were woken up by the intruders before they were bound and gagged. While incarcerated, Smith and Hickock had been told by a fellow inmate that the Clutter family kept a large amount of cash inside a safe at their farmhouse, but this turned out to be untrue, as no such safe existed. The two men responded by slashing Herbert Clutter's throat and then shot every single member of the family in the head before fleeing the scene. Smith and Hickock would remain fugitives for over a month before they were finally captured in Las Vegas on December the 30th. Both men were subsequently convicted and sentenced to death for the murders before they were executed by hanging on April the 14th, 1965. As you probably know, the case attained worldwide notoriety after famous author Truman Capote published a book about the crime titled In Cold Blood, which remains one of the most highly read true crime books of all time. Now, given that the Walker family murders took place during the period of time when Smith and Hickock were on the run, and there were a number of similarities with the Clutter family murders, investigators explored the possibility that the two men may have been responsible for both crimes. There's actually a brief section in Cold Blood where Capote references the Walker murders, describing a scene where Smith read about the crime in the newspaper and remarked to Hickock that the murders of the Clutters may have inspired this. When Smith and Hickock were questioned about the Walker murders, they admitted to having traveled through Florida, but denied ever visiting Sarasota County. Both men passed polygraphs, and In Cold Blood seems to imply that they were eliminated as suspects because they had solid alibis on the day of the crime. But in the years following its publication, a number of factual inaccuracies have been discovered in the book. The timeline in Cold Blood is that Smith and Hickock spent the evening of December the 18th, 1959, sleeping in their car parked by the side of the road near the Alabama-Florida border. They traveled to the state the following day and spent the evening of December the 19th at a hotel in Tallahassee. In actuality, records showed that the two men had checked into a hotel in Miami Beach on December the 18th and paid for 1 week's stay in advance, and no witnesses could confirm having seen them in Tallahassee until the 21st. On the morning of December the 19th, Smith and Hickock decided to check out of the Miami Beach hotel, even though management refused to give them a refund on the additional days they had already paid for. Miami is located over 200 miles southeast of Osprey, but the two men would be spotted in Sarasota County later that day as they were seen purchasing items from a Sarasota department store located only a few miles from the Walker residence. The following day, the owner of a gas station just outside of Arcadia claimed that two men driving a 1956 Chevrolet Bel Air stopped to ask for directions. He would later identify the two men as Smith and Hickock, who were driving a stolen Chevy Bel Air at that time, but what's most interesting is that the witness described Hickock as having a badly scratched up face. Now, this car is another important detail because, as you recall, Cliff Walker had been planning to trade in his family car and frequented some used car lots on the day he was killed, and one vehicle he expressed interest in was a 1956 Chevrolet. So theoretically, Smith and Hickock could have gained access to the Walker home under the pretense of arranging a trade for their car. When the two men were arrested, one of them was carrying a pocket knife which was similar to the one which was stolen from Cliff Walker. And on Christmas Eve of that year, Smith and Hickock sold 2 dolls wrapped in Christmas paper to a minister in Louisiana. There was speculation that these dolls may have originally been intended as Christmas presents for Debbie and had been lying under the Walkers' Christmas tree before they were stolen. One reason that Smith and Hickock did not seem like promising suspects during the initial investigation is that the unidentified fingerprints found on the bathtub faucet in the Walker residence did not match either of them, but like I mentioned earlier, it now seems more likely that they were actually palm prints. And of course, while polygraph tests were given a lot more weight 60 years ago, modern investigators are well aware of how unreliable they are, so they do not put much stock into the fact that both men passed them when they were originally questioned. Following their execution, Smith and Hickock were buried at Mount Muncie Cemetery in Lansing, Kansas, so the Sarasota County Sheriff's Office made arrangements to exhume their bodies. They hoped to extract some mitochondrial DNA from their bones to see if it matched any of the semen evidence from Christine's underwear. Well, in August of 2013, the Sheriff's Office announced that the results were inconclusive. DNA was taken from Smith's femur bone and did not match the semen, but only a partial DNA profile could be extracted from Hickock's remains, and since the samples from the murder scene were old and degraded, it could not be conclusively determined if Hickock's DNA was a match or not. It's worth noting that during the Clutter family murders, Hickock had made an attempt to rape the teenage daughter, Nancy, but Smith intervened and prevented this. If both these men were responsible for the Walker murders, Hickock likely would have been the one who sexually assaulted Christine, so the fact that Smith was excluded as being the source of the semen sample did not necessarily rule him out as being involved in the crime. In spite of the inconclusive results, Smith and Hickock are still both considered to be viable suspects. In a surprising turn of events, Cliff Walker's niece contacted investigators in November of 2012 and revealed that Cliff and Christine's marriage certificate had turned up among some items which were recently given to her by a relative. It's not entirely clear how the marriage certificate wound up there, but this development seemed to indicate that it was not actually stolen by the killer. In 2018, the Sarasota County Sheriff's Office announced that they were going to attempt to use genetic genealogy in hopes of potentially turning up a match to the DNA evidence somewhere. Thus far, their attempts have been unsuccessful, so after 60 years, the Walker family murders continue to remain unsolved. So I guess you could say the trail went cold. Okay, before I move on any further, I guess I should apologize for presenting such an horrific case so close to Christmas. It didn't really hit me until after I finished working on this that along with the Las Cruces bowling alley massacre, this is the second case I've covered in under a month, which features children getting shot in the head. So I promise there will be a moratorium on these types of stories for a while. But like I said in the Las Cruces episode, anyone who is capable of firing bullets into the head of a toddler is a special kind of evil. I think one of the main reasons it's very tempting to believe that the killers of the Walker family were Perry Smith and Richard Hickock is because they were captured a week and a half later and eventually executed. If they're the guilty parties, then justice ultimately prevailed in this case. Like many people, I first became familiar with the Walker murders in 2012 when a number of articles came out about the attempts to link this crime to Smith and Hickock. I mean, even though In Cold Blood is one of the most famous true crime books ever written, Truman Capote only spends a few paragraphs talking about the Walker murders, so even if you've read the book, it's easy to forget this case was even mentioned. Of course, whenever a cold case has a tentative connection to another famous crime, it's very tempting to try and link them together, but this connection is pretty compelling. If Smith and Hickock were not involved, then it would be one hell of a coincidence if the murderers of a family from Kansas happened to be in the same county in Florida on the exact same date that an entirely different family was murdered under similar circumstances. I definitely think there are interesting arguments both for and against the theory that Smith and Hickock were the perpetrators, but I'll talk more about that later on. One of the biggest arguments which is used to point away from Smith and Hickock is that they were strangers just passing through the area, but some of the details of the crime suggest the perpetrator knew the Walker family personally and may have had an infatuation with Christine. One particularly odd detail is that Jimmie's cowboy hat was apparently put on Debbie's head before the killer shot her, almost as if he couldn't bear to look directly at her face while he did this. The two murdered children were only 3 years and 23 months old respectively, so they were not going to be reliable witnesses if they were left alive. But if they knew the shooter and could potentially recognize him, he may have felt the need to kill them to avoid being identified. I can believe that when the killer showed up at the Walker residence that day, they weren't originally planning on killing anyone. He may have intended to make advances towards Christine, but when she resisted him and fought him off, things turned violent. Interestingly enough, while the murder weapon was never found, there were two friends of the Walker family who seemed to remember that Christine kept a .22 caliber pistol on a shelf inside the closet in Jimmie's bedroom. If this is true, then maybe it was Christine who grabbed the gun in an attempt to defend herself before the killer took it away from her. This would definitely explain why the first shot which grazed her head took place in the bedroom, but if the killer did not even bring their own gun, then this supports the idea that the crime was not premeditated. The evidence showed that the killer had been making an attempt to clean up the blood, so perhaps he was originally intending to take Christine's body away from the scene to dispose of her, but since Cliff and the children arrived home, he wound up killing them too. If Smith and Hickock were the perpetrators, it seems odd that they would attempt to clean up the murder scene, given that they were just passing through the area. However, if the killer was a local resident, they may have felt more compelled to cover their tracks. What we do know is that Christine returned home about 20 to 30 minutes before Cliff and the children, who likely walked in during or after the attack on her. It seems significant that the family car was not parked outside the house in its usual spot, which implies that someone else had already arrived and was waiting there when Christine got home. The fact that the groceries were put away implies that Christine likely invited the perpetrator into the house and was going about her regular household business before she was attacked. Quite a bit of gossip about Christine circulated throughout the community following the murders, as she caught the eye of a number of local men, and there were rumors she may have been conducting a secret affair, though that was never conclusively proven. But it's very plausible that the killer's infatuation with Christine may have been the motive for this crime. So now we're going to talk about potential suspects. One of the biggest criticisms about the original investigation is that some suspects, including Perry Smith and Richard Hickock, were initially ruled out strictly because they passed lie detector tests. Of course, nowadays, we know that polygraphs are notoriously unreliable, but law enforcement put a lot more stock into the results 60 years ago. Now, some of the people who passed polygraphs, including Don McLeod and Cliff's cousin Albert Walker, voluntarily submitted to DNA testing decades later and were excluded, so we can safely say that they didn't do it. But there are other potential suspects who have never had their DNA taken, either because they are dead or their current whereabouts are unknown, so they should not be conclusively ruled out. One of these persons of interest was Wilbert Tooker, the Walkers' nearest neighbor who passed away a few years after the crime took place. On the surface, he does seem like a compelling suspect, since he seemed obsessed with Christine and even showed up at the Walker residence on more than one occasion and tried to kiss Christine when her husband was not there. It's interesting that some of the Walkers' clothing, which the killer likely used to wipe blood off themselves, was found in a shed about a mile from the residence. This suggested that they may have been familiar with the area, and since Tooker lived nearby, he may have known this shed was an ideal place to dispose of evidence. But in a way, the fact that Tooker had a prior history of lecherous advances towards Christine almost makes him a more unlikely suspect. Since Christine had enough time to enter the house and put the groceries away, she probably invited the killer inside and was comfortable enough having him around while she did this. But the last time Tooker was there, he tried to kiss Christine, and this made Cliff so angry that he warned Tooker not to come around the house anymore. So I have my doubts that Christine would have willingly invited Tooker inside. I know Tooker's whereabouts could not be accounted for between 4 and 5 p.m. that afternoon, before he went to have dinner with a friend, but I'm not sure the lack of alibi is all that troubling when you consider that Tooker's whereabouts after 5 o'clock are pretty well accounted for. Remember, the Walker residence was located in a pretty remote area, and Cliff and the children are believed to have gotten home at around 4:30 or so. Sarasota is located about 10 miles away, so would Tucker really have had enough time to murder the family, clean himself off, meet up with his friend, and then spend the rest of the night having dinner and playing violin at a concert as if nothing happened? As tempting as it may be to think that Tucker was the perpetrator, I just don't think he quite fits. Another potential suspect who died before he could be DNA tested was Stanley Mauck, the Walkers' meter reader. There really isn't anything to link Mauck to this crime, other than the fact that he seemed to have major psychological problems and talked about having urges to kill his own family, and he also happened to be the meter reader at a residence in Sarasota where another brutal unsolved murder took place 4 months earlier. The death of Chandler Steffens, aka the Sarasota mummy murder, is incredibly baffling in its own right and could possibly be the subject of its own Trail Went Cold episode. The night before he was killed, there was an incident where Steffens woke up in the middle of the night to discover that his sofa had been set on fire, and I'm sure this was done by the same person who later killed him. What's truly bizarre is that the house belonged to Steffens' stepmother, and he'd only been living there for 48 hours before he was murdered. Prior to this, Steffens had not lived in Sarasota for years, and only a small handful of people, who were all eliminated as suspects, even knew he would be staying at that house. There have never been any solid suspects in this crime, and the only thing which links Stanley Mauck is that he happened to be the house's meter reader. But unless Mauck just happened to be servicing the meter during the 48-hour period Steffens was staying at the house, I'm not sure how he would have even known someone was there. I don't know how well acquainted the Walker family was with Mauck, but theoretically, if he went to their house to read the meter, and was there when Christine arrived home, she may have been comfortable enough with Mauck to invite him inside. But the circumstances of the Walker murders and the Sarasota mummy murder are a lot different, as Steffens' murder was a prolonged, premeditated crime, which seemed to be planned at least one day in advance and took place in the middle of the night, whereas the Walker murders were quick and sloppy and took place during the daytime. I'm inclined to think the crimes are not connected at all, but there's really no evidence to prove or disprove Mauck's involvement. I guess the only way to know for sure would be if Mauck's remains were ever exhumed for DNA testing. The other interesting potential suspect was Curtis McCall, who was allegedly conducting an affair with Christine, but it sounds like there was no evidence to back that up besides gossip and hearsay, and I'm not sure investigators even heard about these rumors until Curtis's cousin came forward and told them this years later. There's nothing to really implicate Curtis, aside from the fact that he had a violent temper, seemed very nervous and on edge following the murders, and once owned a .22 caliber gun, which he claimed to have sold to someone whose name he could not remember. It's interesting how when he took a polygraph, the only question where Curtis showed signs of deception was, have you withheld any information about the Walker murders? But again, this is an early 1960s polygraph test we're talking about, so I'm not sure how much stock you can put into that. It could mean that Curtis was telling the truth when he said he had no involvement in the murders, but he still withheld details about his relationship with Christine. The theory that the entire family was murdered by a man Christine had an affair with is a compelling one, but since it involves tainting the reputation of a married murder victim, you always hate to push these theories forward without proof. Christine had allegedly been asking some of her friends questions about how to terminate a pregnancy, which I'm sure led to gossip that perhaps Curtis got her pregnant. But let's also not forget that she suffered through 2 miscarriages that year, so an alternate explanation is that Cliff had gotten her pregnant, and Christine just could not bear the prospect of potentially suffering through a 3rd miscarriage. Whatever the case, we know that Christine was not pregnant at the time she was murdered, so this whole angle might not mean anything. When a series of articles were published about this case in the Sarasota Herald-Tribune in December of 2005, they stated that Curtis McCall's current whereabouts were unknown. This was during the same time period when other potential suspects were going through DNA testing, so I'm sure the investigators were hoping to test Curtis as well if they could find him. I'm not sure if they ever had any success at tracking him down in the years since then, or if he's even still alive today. You might recall the anonymous phone call in 1994 from the female bartender in Stroudsburg, Pennsylvania, who claimed that an older customer of hers made an emotional confession to the Walker murders. If her story is true, some people have wondered if that man might have been Curtis McCall, but once again, even though Curtis might be a compelling suspect, there really isn't any strong evidence to prove or disprove his involvement. So now we finally have to address the likelihood of Perry Smith and Richard Hickock being the perpetrators, and there is a pretty compelling case for that on the surface. For decades, it seems like no one really looked at them that seriously as suspects, largely due to the fact that In Cold Blood gave off the incorrect impression that the two men had alibis. As iconic as the book might be, it did contain a lot of factual errors, particularly when it came to Smith and Hickock's movements while they were on the run. Plus, another reason they were initially discounted as suspects is because their fingerprints did not match the prints found on the bathtub faucet at the Walker residence, but as the years have gone by, it seems more likely that it was actually a palm print. We have numerous eyewitness sightings placing the two men in that area of Florida around the time of the murders, and while eyewitnesses can be mistaken, some of these sightings are pretty credible. I think the most interesting is from the gas station owner outside Arcadia, who said that Smith and Hickock stopped and asked for directions on December the 20th. Not only did he identify the two men, but he accurately described the 1956 Chevrolet Bel Air they were driving, and even got 2 digits on their license plate correct. But what was particularly interesting is that he said the man matching Hickock's description had a badly scratched up face. It was obvious that Christine Walker put up a major fight against the person who attacked her, and since both of her high-heeled shoes had blood on them, she likely used them as a weapon to defend herself. If Hickock was the perpetrator, then this would explain the scratches on his face. Of course, one of the biggest arguments against Smith and Hickock is that the evidence suggested that Christine knew her killer and invited him into the house while she performed tasks like putting her groceries away. Would she have really done this for two strangers, especially when her husband wasn't home yet? Well, in 2016, true crime writer J.T. Hunter published a book about the Walker murders titled In Colder Blood and presented a fairly plausible theory about how Smith and Hickock might have wound up at the house. I mentioned earlier that Cliff visited some used car lots because he was looking to trade in the family car for a newer model, and one of the vehicles which caught his eye was a 1956 Chevrolet, the same model which Smith and Hickock were driving at that time. If the two men somehow crossed paths with the Walkers that day and showed Cliff their Chevy Bel Air, they may have arranged a meeting to trade vehicles at the Walker residence. When Cliff and the children were at the McLeod residence later that afternoon, Don and Lucy asked if they wanted to stay for a little while longer, but Cliff specifically said that they needed to get going because it was almost 4 o'clock. So could this mean that Cliff had a scheduled meetup with Smith and Hickock? Given that the Walkers' residence was in a very remote location at the end of a dirt road, it seems doubtful that the duo could have stumbled upon that place by accident. But if they had a pre-arranged meeting, and Christine had already met both men earlier that day, they may have already been parked at the house when Christine got home, and she was comfortable enough with them to invite them inside while they waited for Cliff. Now, there were 2 separate unidentified hairs found at the murder scene which were inconsistent with anyone from the family, which would make sense if there were 2 killers. One of the hairs was dark and theoretically could have matched Smith, and the blonde hair found inside Christine's dress could have belonged to Hickock. When DNA testing was performed on the semen evidence many decades later, Smith was excluded, but the results on Hickock were inconclusive. That's a very important detail, because even though Smith had no qualms about murdering an entire family, he had a major revulsion about rape, and was so adamant about stopping Hickock from raping Nancy Clutter that the 2 men nearly broke out into a fight. But perhaps this time around, Smith couldn't stop Hickock from raping Christine Walker, and while we cannot conclusively prove this, the semen and the blonde hair could belong to Hickock. Another detail which may point to 2 killers is that even though most of the shots were fired from a .22 caliber weapon, a .32 caliber slug was found near Christine's body. I find that detail strange, as it's always been theorized that the reason the killer drowned Debbie in the bathtub was because they ran out of bullets in their .22. But if they also had a .32 caliber weapon, why not use that to shoot Debbie and finish the job? Two separate guns might suggest two killers, but then again, it's possible that the .22 actually belonged to Christine and she grabbed it out of the bedroom closet when she was trying to defend herself. The other thing which would seem to lean against Smith and Hickock being the perpetrators is the fact that this crime did seem more personal in nature. When the duo murdered the Clutter family, the motive was robbery, as they were under the mistaken impression that the Clutters had a safe of money inside their house and only elected to kill the family because they didn't want to leave them alive as witnesses. The Walker family were far from wealthy, so they seemed like pretty unlikely targets for a robbery. Only a handful of items were stolen from the Walker home, but even if the family didn't have much, it's surprising that Smith and Hickock wouldn't have taken whatever they could get their hands on, as they were living day to day on the run as wanted fugitives and needed anything they could find to survive. Now, it seems like there's some confusion about the disappearance of the Walkers' marriage certificate. For years, everyone believed that the certificate was stolen from the wall in the living room, which would lend credence to the idea that the killer was someone who was infatuated by Christine and angry about her being married to someone else. But in the aforementioned book, In Colder Blood, they mentioned that Cliff's niece contacted investigators in 2012 because the marriage certificate suddenly turned up in some items given to her by a relative. I really wish I could find other sources which provide additional clarification about this, because I'd really like to know how this relative got the certificate to begin with. I'm not trying to say they were personally involved in the murders, but perhaps they wound up receiving it on a previous occasion, and everyone mistakenly assumed that the killer had stolen it. Regardless, it seems like the one item which has still never been accounted for is Christine's missing drum majorette uniform from her high school days, which is undoubtedly the weirdest detail of this case. If Christine was murdered by a stranger, then perhaps I could see them taking the uniform as some sort of souvenir or memento of their crime. But this uniform was being kept in a plastic bag inside a chest, so unless they happened to come across it during a random search of the house, how would a stranger have even known it was there? I really don't see why Smith and Hickock would elect to steal a random item like that. Even if they wanted to keep the uniform as a memento of some sort, what actually happened to it? I know that when they were arrested, they had a pocket knife on them, which matched the one which was stolen from Cliff, but there's never been any mention of a drum majorette's uniform, and that does not sound like a typical item you would pawn if you needed money. I guess the other possibility is that, like the marriage certificate, the uniform somehow went missing from the home before the crime took place, and it has never turned up. But otherwise, I think it's the strongest piece of evidence to indicate that this crime was motivated by the killer's obsession with Christine. Without the missing uniform, I would be much more inclined to believe that Smith and Hickock were the perpetrators, but part of me still believes that this was some sort of crime of passion in which Christine was the primary target, and her husband and children were collateral damage. I don't know. I think you can plant me firmly on the fence regarding this case. It's very frustrating that there doesn't seem to be enough usable DNA on Richard Hickock's remains or the evidence to do a proper test, because determining if he was the source of the semen would answer a lot of questions about this case. The fact that the home invasion murders of two separate families took place in entirely different states within 1 month of each other, and the same two people just happened to be in the area when the second crime took place, is just too much of a coincidence to ignore. But I still have the nagging feeling that it might only be a coincidence, and the real perpetrator was someone much closer to the family who lived in the area. Last year, investigators talked about using genetic genealogy with the DNA evidence, so maybe that will help them conclusively solve the crime, even if the killer or killers are already long dead. But if by chance you happen to have any information about the Walker family murders, please contact the appropriate authorities. Once again, another special thanks to Alanna LaForce for doing such a great job at narrating our opening. We've been doing this contest for over 2 years now, and if you've already entered it before, you are still automatically eligible for all of our random monthly drawings, so you don't have to do anything else. But if you'd like to enter the contest and haven't already done so, please send me an email with the subject line, Trail Went Cold Contest, listing the one unsolved cold case you would most like to see featured on this podcast. Once again, send me an email under the subject line, Trail Went Cold Contest, to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Another reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. We produced a bunch of exclusive bonus episodes for our patrons in tiers 2 and 3, and this past month, our bonus episode covered a very rare final appeal case which was featured on Unsolved Mysteries about the controversial conviction of Thomas Drake for the attempted murder of his wife, Nancy Drake. And for our patrons in Tier 3, I've also recorded another new audio commentary track which can be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries. So to learn more information, feel free to visit our Patreon page. I'd also like to give a shout out to our most recent listeners who have signed up with us on Patreon this week, and they are Sean T., Sammy, Dylan S., Katie G., Todd W., Christopher S., Cynthia S., Jeffrey B., and Minette F. Thank you all so much for your support. And before I bring this episode to a close, I would like to play a promo for another true crime podcast, Women and Crime.
In the last several years, criminologists have really begun to focus on the topic of women in crime. This interest has inspired Amy and I to create a podcast devoted entirely to true stories about women in crime. Twice a month, we will discuss individual stories of women who have been victims of crime or perpetrators. Sometimes these two are one and the same. We will also choose cases in which women have been falsely accused, exonerated, or women whose work in the criminal justice system has brought them notoriety. By staying true to our criminologist roots, we will tell you the full stories of these women, but we will also explain the cause of the events that happened and whether the criminal justice system got it right or not. No matter what, this podcast will focus on women in crime all of the time, so stay tuned. Women in Crime is available now.
I also just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. Need to provide a big thanks to McGill Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or review on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music, or Spotify. Anyway, like I mentioned in the intro, this will be the last official episode of The Trail Went Cold in 2019, as we will be taking next week off for Christmas Day, and returning on Wednesday, January the 1st, 2020, for a special update episode of the podcast. So I want to wish everyone a happy holidays, and thank you all for your support and helping make 2019 such a memorable year for our show. So join us again in 2 weeks, or should I say, join us again next year for a very special new episode of The Trail Went Cold.